Hey, welcome back to Unschooled Theology. I'm one of your hosts, Derick. With me today, as usual, Evan. Good day, sir.
Good day to you, sir.
All right, let's dive in here. We're looking at Genesis 2:9. And out of the ground the Lord God made to spring up every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. The tree of life was in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. All right, so we talked about the significance of trees a little bit before, right? When it was mentioned that there were no trees or bushes on the earth, and that's the idea that they are rooted in the earth but reach toward the heavens,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And this is interesting when we think of that idea of the word here used for garden, sort of also can mean
Also meaning
orchard,
orchard. You
right?
mentioned that before, and this feels like that supports it too. That
Yeah,
this is the thing that they mentioned God planting.
a part of it, yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. And so here it's made clear, and I think this is interesting, that God is still the source of that which reaches towards the heavens, as
Mm-hmm.
well as that which falls from the heavens towards the earth, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because God is the one who planted the trees. So while man is meant to, cultivate them and tend to them in the garden,
Mm-hmm.
it is still God who plants them, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so then we move on to this idea that these trees are both pleasing to look at and good for food. And I think um, so. The most important thing we might be able to take from this is very much similar to the idea of what was expressed by Jesus when he said, "By their fruits ye shall know them."
Mm-hmm.
Um, every tree in the garden is reaching up to the heavens as it's meant to, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's behaving in concert with God's order. And so the result of that is something that is very good in every way,
Mm-hmm.
right? The fruits are good. They are both pleasing to look at and good for food. And we might relate these ideas, I think, a little more directly than to humanity as well,
Mm-hmm.
with the understanding that those things which rightly reach towards the heavens, right? Those things we do in life which reach us towards the heavens, they provide both pleasure and nourishment,
Mm-hmm.
both things, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think that's important for us to think about, right? Is the
Mm-hmm.
idea of then, okay, behaving within God's order correctly, you
Mm-hmm.
know, tending to an orchard, if you will, having things that reach towards the heavens properly
Mm-hmm.
will produce good fruit,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so they will nourish us, they will build us up, we will become better humans. But not only that, they will also be pleasurable, right?
Mm-hmm.
The things we do that reach towards the heavens are sort of the proper source for us to receive pleasure from.
Mm-hmm.
And so I mean, there's a lot of different ways you can go with this. For Christians, one of the things we understand this in best because it um, tends to be a point of stark contrast with our society today is the idea of sexual relations, right? And the idea that outside of God's order, there might be some short-term pleasure or something, but it's not the pleasure we're meant to seek, and it could
Mm-hmm.
be corrosive in the long term. And then doing it within God's order, right? So it's not adulterous. It provides the proper pleasure, right, within marriage. That is one of the ideas and ways you could think about this, is when you're using things within God's order, you will derive a right pleasure from it, right? Or we could look at the Old Testament and the idea of the law, right? And perhaps someone might have found an ancient Israelite might have found some joy in some bacon and might have found some short-term pleasure there. But in the long term, and this is again, we'll get all this more when we get into the law. Pigs are a particularly dirty animal, and when not properly raised and cared for, they can actually pass disease and heavy metals and environmental hazards onto humans if humans eat them, better than or worse, I guess, than other animals. So the prohibition against pigs was actually very practical from a health standpoint back then. And so, while you might have enjoyed the piece of bacon, you could have ingested something that potentially could have done some long-term damage, right?
Mm-hmm.
So again, that idea of working within God's order. And then of course, by the time we get actually to the New Testament, we've reached a point where livestock is better cared for in a way where you have less concerns about that related to pigs. Hence the removal of that prohibition with Peter's dream and everything. But that is, I think, what this verse is kind of getting at when it's talking about trees. It's talking about things that are rooted in earth but reach towards the heavens, producing both good fruit, nourishment, and pleasurable to look at.
Yeah. I guess there's two ways you can take this, and I think both ways are correct. You can take it as some sort of measuring device, which seems to be at least part of what you're implying, is that this is a good way to judge where if you are going in the right direction.
Right.
Um,
Jesus, by their fruits you shall know them.
exactly. So it can be used both as that, but then I think it's also can be viewed as marching orders, as
Yeah.
this is intended to be what should be targeting as well.
Right.
You should be targeting these two things. I think it's important that this is functional. We talked about this, I think it was in the interim of last time, but we talked about a garden being functional. It's this cultivation of nature in a ordered manner, but it also has function that is intended for man. That,
Yeah.
that man is the one who can appreciate the functions. And I think the functions are so important here that it's good to rehash them out. Pleasant to the sight, which means that beauty has value.
Yes.
Like
Yes.
this is almost a stamp of approval by God on saying that it is significant that as a human you look at something and find it beautiful.
Right.
And you
Right.
talked about the sexual relations things, and I think even the basest of persons typically wouldn't look at a one night stand and say that was a beautiful experience.
Right.
They
Right.
would they might say it was pleasurable or
In a
something of that
way, yeah.
nature.
Yeah.
Yeah, it felt good, but they wouldn't say it's beautiful in the
Yeah.
same way. Oftentimes there's a shame associated with it. I mean, even void of we're one of the most probably free, one of the more free sexual cultures in history, but there's still shame associated with it a
Yeah.
lot of times. And it's
Yeah.
like, well, then that seems to be something that's ingrained, that you're not looking at that as a beautiful moment in your life. You're looking at it with a different perspective. So I think that's valuable. And then the other side is nourishment, and saying that our goal is to sustain and fulfill. Um, I want to say one more thing about the beauty and the dynamic between the two of them, because I think fair enough, one conversation I've seen in regards to the church over well the past couple thousand years has been its support of artistic endeavors.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
cathedrals are the perfect example of this, of
Mhm.
saying like, well, they made these massive cathedrals, but look at how many people are starving. And it's like, this feels like it adds a nuance to that debate, because
Yes.
this places, and actually it places pleasant to the sight before it placed nourishment. It said pleasing to the sight and then good to eat. And so there's this way in which, to be proper, I guess, followers of the order that God's wanting us to establish, we are supposed to value beautiful things, and we are
Yeah.
supposed to support that and cultivate that in the same way that we cultivate caring for other
And
people.
you see that frowned upon sometimes, I think, within Protestantism, especially. I think it's Calvin who sort of
Yeah,
rails
John
against
Calvin.
that.
Yeah, so Calvinists are the ones who have very, very
Right.
plain
Right.
churches. A very
Right.
plain, simple white church without any sort of adornment.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And the argument here is yeah, very much what you're saying. No, there's benefit to beauty, and um I think that holds true in a lot of aspects of life, that when you begin working more closely with God's order, you create things that are more beautiful.
Yeah.
In a sense. So
well, and there's this way in which, sorry, this is just coming, I'm thinking of this as
yeah.
we're talking about it. There's this way in which these two functions connect both sides of what we're talking about. because the fundamental of nourishment and needing to eat in order to sustain life, that's very much connected to the world. That's very much connected to the physical things. We have that in common with every other living thing.
Yeah.
However, the one distinction that we have more in common with God, is that we can look at something and create a judgment of it and say, this is pleasing to the sight.
Right.
And God is the one who just in the previous chapter made all of creation and kept casting a judgment and saying, this is good. And it's like humanity is the only ones who can look at something and say, this is good, as opposed to saying this is just nourishing. And so the two functions really are that gap that bridges us between earthly in the sense of nourishment and then being able to assess beauty in the sense of,
and we could tie this into, we recently as a extended family here took a trip to Niagara Falls, right?
Yeah.
And that is that's an interesting situation, I think, of cultivation, where you have the falls are immensely beautiful.
Yeah.
And you have this idea where they were inaccessible to people, right? The region hadn't been cultivated. There was great beauty there, but in a way that beauty was wilderness, right? It hadn't been tamed. And then you have this period where the falls are sort of industrialized and the beauty sort of removed from it entirely.
Historically, like mid-20s, as industrialists come in and they see the power of this massive flowing river. And in an industrial age, you look at that and say, look, that's power. So I think that leans towards the nourishment side. Is that can help us create physical,
they made it very
things
fruitful.
that can meet physical needs.
They made it nourishing,
Exactly. Fruitful in the way that it was fruitful for nourishment. Yeah.
But then there's an argument to be made that, well, no, it needs to be both, and now you have this sort of cultivation of it where you appreciate the beauty from it. And I think through that appreciation of the beauty, you are then nourished in a way, and so that's and I think too, I would argue where we see beauty the most is in nature, in places where there is like a sense of order to it. If you look at things like obviously we find oceans and those kind of things, we find beauty in those. But if we look a little more narrowly at places where there are rivers that cut through an area, like they do something functionally within that area. There's some order to a river going through an area and depositing water and carrying things down the stream as it needs to be. There's something ordered about that, more so than just the chaos of the ocean. So I think where we find those kinds of things, we find the most beauty in that. And so I think we're sort of meant to kind of reflect that.
I have a fairly reasonable example of that. I think that what you're getting at, I remember I was down in, this was back when I was in Ohio, and I went with a buddy down to Red River Gorge, which is in Kentucky.
Okay.
And it's a big giant gorge. It's a beautiful place. You got a lot of hikes you can go up and have wonderful like overlooks and stuff like that. And so we climbed up on top of one and we're looking down over like this beautiful scene that was covered in trees and everything like that. And then there was some cleared land. And then there was like a little cabin like over, in the middle of this. And my friend looks at me and he says, look, like this would be beautiful except for that. He was like, I don't like the fact that little cabin's there. I want it to just be, pure nature. And I said, look, this is actually more beautiful because that cabin's there. They have cleared a little bit of land for them to be and exist in that place, in this beautiful place that is mostly wilderness, and they are functioning properly in it. And the cabin was, it wasn't an eyesore. It was aesthetically beautiful, and it fit exactly as it should fit. And it was like, no, you got to look at that and say, that's humanity interacting
It gives
with nature in a good way.
It gives context.
It does. Exactly.
I've thought this, I used to live in Grand Haven, Michigan, in that area. and they had a power plant there that, as you would sort of walk from the pier back inland, one of the big smokestack things loomed over top, and that's no longer there. It was voted to be gotten rid of and torn down and all this, and I miss it actually.
Yeah.
The just that being there, it was like a context where you could kind of measure everything by.
Yeah.
I think of too, something I enjoy is, you can follow accounts dedicated to these on Instagram, but castles, right? And it's very interesting when you have a series of mountains and there's a castle perched atop it too, which is designed very well to sort of fit in with the region and everything. But you look at that castle and it's like, yeah, the mountains would be pretty and stuff without that, but actually that castle being there really just brings everything together. It's this
Exactly.
it's this context that really fills out, I think, the picture,
Yeah.
and gives it sort of a focus, I guess, that you can then appreciate everything else out from that central point. So
Exactly.
yeah, I
Exactly.
think there is something to that. And by the way, that's not to say that the smokestack was the correct thing, to have there in Grand Haven. Maybe there should be a castle built there instead. But
The
I
Castle
guess my
Grandhaven. I
point
like that.
being, having this sort of like thing that represented humanity, bringing order to the area, increased the beauty of that
Mm-hmm.
spot,
Mm-hmm.
if that makes sense. So,
Mm-hmm.
all right, well, that's an overview of trees. So, next we will look at. Oh, you know what? Actually, let's hit it here because I do want to hit this before we're going to look at the two trees specifically next episode. So there is one small thing I wanted to
Of
hit,
course.
which is that trees are significant in many different mythologies. I think that's
Yeah.
worth mentioning here. Notably, what most people would probably recognize, thanks to the popularity of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, is the idea of the Norse world tree.
Yeah.
Um, I'm not great on the pronunciation, but it's like Yggdrasil or something like that.
That sounded great to me.
There we go. Sure.
I don't know if I'm going to be able to get you on that one.
Sure.
Yeah, to our listeners who are of Nordic descent or living in a Nordic country, we apologize.
Yeah. Yeah.
Feel free to message us with the correct
Yeah, the correct
pronunciation. I guess.
pronunciation.
Yeah, that
Sure.
sounded good.
So trees, though, that they are a recurring motif in the Bible, and there is, I think, some overlap between the Bible and all these mythologies, where there's that trees are often symbolic representations of all creation, right? And
Mhm.
so, just as all creation sort of is meant to reach towards the heavens and produce fruit, which is rooted in earthly lives, we live cyclical lives, which is similar to trees have cycles. We go through cycles. All of creation goes through cycles, weather in different seasons, and there's those cyclical elements over and over and over. That is why trees have this representation, to them,
Mhm.
as
Mhm.
symbolizing or sort of being a microcosm of the idea of all creation.
Yeah.
They really parallel the idea of all
Exactly.
creation.
Exactly. Yeah.
Um, and so we'll explore some of those ideas more closely as we go on, but it's worth remembering that's a repeated motif in the Bible, and it relates to going all the way to Christ's being put upon a cross, which we call a tree.
Yeah. Exactly.
That there's good reason for that, and there's good reason for he wasn't hung on a natural tree. He was hung on a man-made, bastardization of the idea of a tree.
Yeah. Yeah.
This ugly thing that we've created to do this horrible thing with.
Yeah.
The sort of the antithesis of what a tree is really meant to do.
Exactly.
And so the tree idea builds up to that and sort of culminates in that. So
Yeah.
wanted to throw that in at the end and just realize we'll come back to trees as we go on.
Yeah.
But there's a lot to it. So, all right, next time, like I said, we'll talk about these two trees a little more specifically, and we'll look forward to seeing you then. Be sure to subscribe on whatever platform you're getting this on, rate, review, comment, email us unschooltheology@protonmail.com, and we'll talk to you then. Thanks.